How was your weekend, man?
Pretty good. We made bagels.
Oh,
Yeah.
I think I saw on Instagram.
Yeah.
They were good?
They were good. I'm actually excited to go back and experiment with, how long to boil them, how long to bake them, how big they should be.
How do you make a bagel?
So this is something I learned yesterday. You make dough. So flour. I actually don't know how to make dough. My wife does this part. I think it's like flour, sugar, yeast, water. And I think you just let that rise for an hour or two. And then you roll it into balls, poke a little hole in it for the bagel hole.
Oh.
And then you boil them. And then you bake them.
Oh.
Yeah. And
Why do you boil them?
I don't know. I think that gets like the chewiness. I think that makes bagels are they're more chewy than bread. Bread is nice and soft. So I think the boiling is what causes the chewiness. But yeah, we put some everything seasoning on them.
Oh man.
Yeah, they were really, really good.
Oh my gosh,
So,
that sounds delicious.
Yeah. Yes.
Everything bagel, one of my top 5 foods of all time, no question. It must have something to do with how I grew up, but forever and ever, that will be one of my favorite foods. That's awesome. I made cookies last week. I got a hand mixer. And
Oh, cool.
I think I might have made cookies one other time in my entire life. So it was all basically new to me. But that was fun from scratch, It's flour, sugar, butter. You mix it up.
All the good stuff.
All the best things. Since I've been tracking my calories, I weigh all my food. So I have that food scale, I think you've seen that.
Yeah.
And for some reason, when I went to do this recipe, I just followed the recipe, the chocolate chip cookie recipe, and it's 3 cups of flour and 2 cups of brown sugar, or a cup of brown sugar and half a cup of white sugar or whatever. And my cookies came out super fat. They got way too fat, and they're too doughy.
Yeah.
They're still good. Doesn't stop me from eating them, but they're not how they're supposed to be. And then you read in the recipe, and they're oh, why did my cookies not flatten? There's too much dough in it. And why do they flatten too much? And it's there's not enough flour in it. Sorry, flour, not dough. So they're oh, if you just take the measuring cup and scoop it into the flour and level it off, you're going to get way too much because it's probably packed because the flour's been sitting there.
Yeah.
And so instead you spoon it out into the measuring cup. And I'm why do recipes do volume at all? Because with weight, you can't mess it up. So then I Googled, after I did this whole thing, I Googled how much flour, how much does a cup of flour weigh? And then there's all these things about what real bakers say about should it be 120 grams or 125 grams? Most bakers go 125 grams. So next time, I'm going to do it again. I'm not going to do the full recipe. I'm going to cut it in half, which apparently is okay to do because I made 23 cookies and I have 10 of them frozen right now. And I've just been taking them out and putting it in the microwave for 30 seconds and eating it in the morning, which is great, but it's also not good for my my diet program. But I really want to try it again. I might even throw these out and just try it again because 125 grams. Everyone should just use weight when it comes to baking.
Not everyone is
food.
like you and has a friggin' food scale. People have measuring cups.
But the thing is, man, it's true, but it just makes it better because then you Google things and people are oh, baking is more of an art than a science. And I'm it doesn't actually, no, cooking and baking is actually a science. And it doesn't have to be an art, and you don't have to worry if your cookies are going to turn out too fat or too thin. They can be perfectly the same exactly every time if you just weigh out your ingredients.
I actually think Katie just bought a baking scale because of this. But yeah, you guys are snobs basically.
I'm
with your baking scales.
I'm going to be a snob, and the next batch I make, man, it's going to be a perfect batch of chocolate chip cookies. And it's going to be my second time doing it. And I'm just going to brag and just sit in my ego of superior baking skills. Nice. So I'm pretty excited about that. Man, I will say it's hard to be in quarantine and have a bag of 22 chocolate chip cookies while I'm tracking calories. I have set myself up to fail. But it is fun eating a cookie with my morning coffee, man, I will say. Oof. I've thought about becoming a very fat person during this time and how much fun it would be. Dude, Nate also won the poker tournament.
Ooh, nice.
32 people, I think.
How much money did he get?
He won like $200.
Sweet.
Yeah. I think like fourth or fifth was in the money.
What did you play this week?
Yeah, I did. I did pretty bad. I think I did a little bit better than my first week, but I overcorrected. So my first week I was playing as if it was a cash game, and I waited way too long and wasn't aggressive enough when I had good cards. Mm-hmm. So I swung too hard. And this week I was like, if I had like a queen 6 and I was like, and I was in on like the flop, I was like, all right, I basically have to go all in at this point.
Well, queen sixes is obviously one of the worst hands in poker.
But if you get no, it's not.
How are you playing?
If you have a high card, that's what I'm telling you, man. I'm telling you, if you think like that, you will just bleed out because the blinds raise so much. It's like worth it to get that queen pair, and like if you do, like you have so few hands that it's like real. I'm telling you, man, this is how everyone was playing. It's just I messed up a few times. Okay. I promise you.
Okay.
I promise you.
Okay.
But it's tough, man. It's tough. And also, I like had this one really good opportunity, and I went like this, and I actually folded instead of raising, and I had like an ace jack. It was ridiculous.
Oh, you play on the phone?
On the phone, and I like did the wrong gesture, so that was pretty bad.
The old misclick.
Yeah, brutal.
My one piece of advice to you would be don't ever call pre-flop. Always be.
Don't ever call. Always be raising, even if you don't have it.
Pre-flop. Don't ever call.
If you don't have the cards.
If you don't have the cards, you should fold.
Oh, fold.
Yeah. But don't ever call. And I think that.
Oh, interesting. Why? Like
there's a lot behind this, but basically the
you're giving everyone an opportunity to just to land like 2 pair of low cards or something.
Exactly.
That makes sense to me, and I was kind of like starting to internalize that, and I was like. That's why if I had like a king 9, I'm like, yeah, I'm either going to raise like 2x or 3x big blind, or like this is not worth it. And it started to make sense a little bit.
Yep.
So that's basically the advice.
Yeah. And you also, too, you want to play more as you get closer to the button. You can play looser. And as you're earlier, you can play less. Positional advantage is so much in poker.
Interesting.
So
I also would like get the dealer sometime, and I would be like, I'm just going to go in because I just feel like there's like, it's like doesn't cost a lot to jump in. There's a lot of people here, and if I land something, then it'll be good. And like, yeah, it's that I wasn't starting to pay attention to the button position until towards closer to the end. So
yeah, I would say like just don't ever. I think your first adjustment is don't ever call pre-flop.
Okay,
interesting, and see how that plays. And there's a lot of times where you'll be like, I really want to play this hand, but I don't want to raise. And that's an indicator that this is not actually a good hand to play.
But what if like everyone's in and it's just like 50 to call, and then you land like trips or something like that, and it's like, I'm just going to like take everybody.
Yeah. So, okay. Like you don't, first of all, you don't have like the math doesn't line up there. Like if you call, you're not going to flop the price that you're paying to call. You're not going to hit trips enough and get paid off with those trips. So the math doesn't line up. But more important is, you just want like the hands that you play to be better than the hands your opponents play. And so you should be playing good hands. If your hands are better, you should be raising.
I was wondering if that is true in a tournament because you have so few hands, and the people who win sometimes feels like they are just...
It's true in all. It's like there's no form of poker where this isn't true.
Really?
Yeah, it's true.
But the EV thing seems like it's... I can play in Vegas for 4 hours and win a couple $100 because the variance is going to smooth itself out because I'm playing so many hands. Whereas a poker tournament, what are they, like 20 hands? I mean, like before I'm knocked out, it's crazy.
It's probably like 100 or so. How long does it take you to get knocked out? Like how long do you play?
Dude, the blinds go up so fast. It's crazy.
Yeah. I mean, okay, so like there's all different tournament structures, and there are tournaments that want, like, the faster the blinds go up, the more of like literal lottery it is, right? So so good players have less of an advantage, and so like some tournaments are structured like that to keep bad players interested, right? You could imagine a tournament where the blinds like go up every day, like 24-hour period. Good players are going to win, bad players are going to lose, and that's like bad players are not going to want to play that game because it sucks to play games that you lose.
Right.
So there's different forms of this. They also need to keep good players interested because good players are, your repeat customers.
So now a question is if they adjust the handicap such that it's like a more of a level playing field and like bad players have an advantage, do the good players, should you switch your strategy or still no?
I mean, so you do. If
the goal is to win the tournament,
you do have to factor in the fact that like you have less blinds. But you generally in all poker you want to play better hands than your opponent, and given that you can select these hands,
interesting. You just act accordingly.
Yeah, but so if I am, let's say we have 100 big blinds, I'm not playing ace 10 from early position.
Yeah,
because it's not a very good hand.
But I don't. I have like 10 or like less. I mean,
right. So if you have 10 big blinds and you have ace 10, this is pretty good. This is a great hand.
Yes.
So that's how it adjusts. But you don't.
I see.
You don't start playing queen 6. So queen 6.
Dude, I'm telling you, man. I'm telling you. All right, I'll have to report back next week. See how it goes. We do it every Saturday. Maybe you'll jump in one of these weeks. It's fun.
Yeah. Sunday is my grind day.
Your poker day.
Yeah.
Nice. You just play like all day.
Yeah, I did like 6 hours yesterday.
Oh wow. How'd you do?
I got crushed, and then when the session ended, I was up $14. So basically a waste of 6 hours.
But did you learn something?
I learned how to waste 6 hours.
What you been working on, man?
More React.
How you feeling about React these days?
I'm actually really, I'm really, really liking it. I've kind of, we talked about this last week, the whole like useEffect thing. I've been looking for examples where useEffect is hard. And when I think of my day to day, like useEffect is really hard. Not only that, but like we talked about last week, I come across in any code base, I just come across an effect that does something and then has an empty, like a defined empty dependency array. So it's used as like an on mount hook. And this is sort of like had me thinking that like, okay, life cycles are a thing. People are thinking in life cycles. Maybe we should just be more explicit about this. But it's funny, every example that I come across where I'm like, we should use a life cycle, I then later can expand this to be an actual effect with
like a more expressive hook.
Yeah, there's basically this is the thing. When you use a life cycle, there's something that you're not describing. There's something you're ignoring. And the effectful code, like the useEffect code, ends up like preventing a bug. It ends up being better code. It's a lot harder to write. And I actually have to like sit there and stare at this and be like, oh, what's missing here? Like, what am I not considering?
Can you give an example?
Yeah. So one from last week was I have an effect that, let's say it fetches data from the server. So you have like a fetch call in your effect, and it fetches it based off like, let's say the user ID. So you're fetching like all the blog posts for a user. So you have an effect call that calls fetch, making an API request with the user ID. So your effect depends on user ID. So when the user ID changes, your effect reruns and updates the component state. This is like the classic use effect. And why you want to do this in an effect is because if you use lifecycle, if you do this on mount and the user ID changes, you don't end up actually fetching that new data. So it's like the whole point behind
this is
effects.
the part of the argument behind the design of the API is that it forces you to synchronize your effects with the state that they rely on.
And not with the lifecycle of the component.
Yeah.
And so you do this by removing lifecycle from the component and saying, when should these effects run? And this is, I actually think this is like, there's a bug that always happens in every app, which is some prop changes. And when you wrote that component, it was impossible for that prop to change. Like it was like, computationally, like logically, it's always possible for a prop to change. But if my component is only ever rendered in a context with a prop that doesn't change, because like changing that prop would cause the parent component to de-render and re-render a new child component. Anyway, yeah. So there's always this bug that would come up, and it's so hard to notice it. The prop changes, you don't fetch new data. And then someone comes along and they add code that like props can be changed. And now your component is like not fetching data when those props change because it's doing all the work in onMount and blah, blah, blah bugs. So effects just make all this go away. And I there's something I really like about this that like React has, they like have your back, right? Like the programming model is forcing you to address this source of bug.
I mean, you're omitting the biggest caveat.
We're going to get
the
there.
Massive caveat. Okay, all right.
So but I think there's something like really elegant about this.
Yeah. It's they've chosen an API that will nudge you and highlight these kinds of issues, which before seemed like they were the kinds of issues that the programming environment and the API could not help you with.
Yeah.
It's like, how can you write an API that helps you write better logic? Well, this is an answer.
Yeah. The problem is that a lot of like for simple cases, this works really well, but then for like more complex cases, like this one that I'm about to describe, you're fetching based off the user ID. And so now your dependencies is a user ID. And then you need to change that. That call to fetch is you're no longer supposed to use a call to fetch inside of a hook. Instead, you're using another library that provides its own load user data function. So just imagine that like version 1, you have an effect with a fetch call, like a literal fetch call.
Yeah.
And a user ID.
And the user ID as a dependency array.
Yep. And then in version 2, you get this library that's like, it's like
use fetch or something.
Use user data.
Okay.
And
you pass in an ID.
And it returns user data. So now your effect has the dependencies change. You have this user data function.
Oh, you're calling the function still in the effect.
Yeah,
so it's still an effect.
You have to. You have to. Yep.
Okay. Oh yeah. Right. Sure. I know where you're going. So yeah, you have some new function in the body of the effect, and now the lint error is going to say you haven't passed the function in as a dependency.
Right. So you go ahead and you pass the function in, and it's fine. When the user ID changes, the function's going to rerun, and everyone's happy. The linter's happy. The only problem is this like fetch user data function. You don't control this, and the function might change. It might change.
You could have inlined it right above the effect, and it will actually be created every time on render.
Yeah. So, and the reason for this is like you can function like an empty function in JavaScript does not equal another empty function. Like they're we would say they're equal in the sense that they do the same things, but they don't have the same identity. And so the effect dependencies, every time that function changes, it's going to rerun the effect. And you can actually make you can kind of step back here and make an argument and say like, this is actually a good thing, or else you're going to end up in the component did mount bug. Because guess what? If that function changes, like we should rerun the effect because you might have stale data.
Sure.
But the problem,
I actually ran into that. My one of my on-click handlers wasn't being reattached, and in the inspector, remember we talked about that last week, and so it was actually a stale version of the function that had closed over the URL, query param being the empty string, and so it did need to reattach itself, the new version of the function.
Yeah, great. So, of course, like you said though, that that function could change. Like if you inline that function above the effect, and every re-render is going to be like a new function, even though it's doing the same thing. And so now your effect is going to run. And so you're just going to constantly be fetching data from the server. And I think like people that know React will say like, well, that function should use callback. So if you're getting that function from another hook, that thing should use callback to basically return a memoized function. So the effect knows that it doesn't need to run this. And like, okay, sure, that's fine. Like that's a good answer. But the reality is like, imagine that fetching function is coming from another code base, another part of your app. Like you don't control that. So you can't just say like, that thing is wrong. It should use that's a really shitty answer.
Yeah, I agree, and I don't even think the React core team would say that is the next step on the ladder of complexity.
Right.
You know?
Right. Because use callback should really be looked at as an optimization. It should not be looked at exactly
as a way to logically solve logical errors.
Yeah, this is a great point. So this is why I found that when you can actually think about the effect. Actually, I want to back up before I go there. So like 2 common ways to solve this are one is just remove the function from the dependency array because you don't want the effect to run when the function changes. But that's not it's wrong.
Answer.
It's wrong because you're right back to component did mount. You're right back to component did mount. You.
Well, I wasn't even expending that many brain cells on it. It's wrong because you're violating the lint rule and so just period, end of sentence. But yes, you're not back. That's not true. You're not back to component did mount because it's rerunning when the param changes.
It's rerunning when the ID changes.
When the ID
but
changes,
you're back to the class of bug that you're back to like the component did mount class of bug.
You're not the API of useEffect is no longer nudging you to solve these sorts of problems that crop up in lifecycle based APIs.
Right.
So yes, for all intents and purposes, yes, you're back to lifecycles. Yep.
And then to address the use callback thing, use callback is not made for control flow
logical errors.
Right.
Yeah.
It's made for like an optimization of like.
Let's check it. What does it actually say?
I don't know.
Docs. Also, there is a third. There's a third way to solve this.
Yeah, I'm gonna.
You getting there?
Oh, we'll get there.
Okay. Well, go ahead. Tell me what it is.
So I think the third way is to use a ref to only run the function when the ID changes. So you can write a ref that's used previous and to do this. But again, this is back. This is still...
You're right. You're back to the situation where you have to explicitly think about the fact that you need to rerun this when this param changes.
Right. So this is a problem. So this is a problem. So one of the things that like React and declarative rendering showed us is we just take state and we render. We take state and we render. We never think about how we go from state 1 to state 2. We're just getting new state and rendering. And with these component lifecycle hooks, we're actually thinking about how we go from 1 to 2. So if you only had things like component did mount, component did update, blah, 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 component will unmount, you are thinking like, okay, what were the previous props? Did those props change? And so now you're thinking of the in-between. Effects, they make it so you don't have to think about the in-between. You just say that like, I depend on this thing and the programming model has your back. When the thing changes, the effect is going to run. But refs are imperative. Like the reason you use refs is you need imperative code. You need to track things between renders. And so you are thinking about the change.
Across time.
Yeah. You are thinking about change because you're saying like, okay, did the ID change between these two renders? And so now you're using an effect. Okay, so effects bring a few things. They bring this what we've been talking about. They also bring a nice API for like having your setup and teardown logic nicely and grouped into one location, one thing. So like there is a benefit of tracking changes using an effect because you can kind of put everything in the same area of your code base.
You're saying even if it was just another way to represent a component lifecycle, it's like it has improvements ergonomically.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. But yeah, we're back to the component.
Do they actually solve the root issue?
Right. We're back to the component did mount bug. Yeah, did update. And we're tracking changes. And so we don't want to do that. And so we should be thinking about like, how can we express this thing with effects? And this is hard.
What's the answer?
It's hard. So in this situation where like I was fetching the users from the server and the function was changing, causing the users to refetch, one of the issues was like on the page, I'm like also editing these users. So I have like a form and I can, I can like edit the users. I can add new users and then I click a button and those things get saved back to the server. But the problem was that my effect would run before I clicked that button. And it would just wipe out my changes because the effect would set state from the users that were fetched from the server.
Ah,
So the answer, like I first started off with like a lifecycle hook.
I see.
I first started off with a lifecycle hook, and the lifecycle hook would only run it on mount. But then, I was like, no, this
When you say lifecycle hook, you mean like use on mount kind of thing?
use on mount. Yep.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I was like, okay, so this should be, I should be able to express this in effect, right? Like I shouldn't have to use a lifecycle. I shouldn't have to use a ref. I should be able to do that. And kind of the answer I landed on is it's okay if my effect reruns, and what the state that the effect is setting, it's really not setting like the users for this component. It's setting state that's like server-side users. And then any edits I make should be buffered in other state. And then that state event, the edits I'm making is in new state. Those edits eventually make it back to the server. My use effect reruns at some point, and like everything's right with the world. But it took me, it took me a long time to figure this out.
So did you end up writing like a custom hook, or did you just do it there right in the component?
No, it's right there in the component. I have to think about
what it would
look like. Yeah,
to extract it.
I'm also like, I don't know. I think that like a lifecycle hook might be okay here. It's what I'm thinking about. Right? It's a lot less code. Having to write code that's like fetch all the users from the server, then render them on the page, and then allow me to edit them, like me, the user behind the keyboard, to edit them, and then like merge the original users from server array with my edits and get that rendering correctly. It's a lot of work. It's actually really hard.
It's super hard, but it does feel like the right answer in the sense that the right answer. Like
the UI is way more robust, right? It's way less buggy, and I'm actually acknowledging that, like, the users on the server are actually they're different from my edits. Yeah. And this way, I can update those users from the server at any point, and like my UI is like truly reactive here.
Yeah.
So
it seems like there's a potentially nice composition story where you use resource user /1, and then you use draft, and you pass in the user, and you bind the draft data to your form, and then when you call commit, it goes back to the store or resource or whatever, and persist it to the server, and you get the state, whether it's persisting, and then you get the revalidation of the query, something like that. Yeah,
I think you're right. Like you don't want to be writing this by hand, especially in like a list and edit users component, because this is going to be like so many of our pages are like fetch data from the server, edit them, click a button, changes go back to the server. Like you don't want to reinvent this with the use state buckets, like every single form you have to make.
Oh yeah, it's ridiculous. Well, the SWR approach, I've been making some egghead videos on SWR, and they only take care of the querying side, and it's stale while revalidate. So that's one approach to this problem, which is just don't worry about having a true connection between the editing data and the server data. Just show the latest server data when they queried it, let them go to town on the edits, and then you can just persist things, and then just go ahead and invoke this mutate function just by itself without any data. Just call it, and your UI will eventually revalidate because you're just letting it know that you need to go back to the server as if the user basically hit Command R.
I know. I think that's a great answer, but it's really hard to write an effect that does that, because eventually.
Well, if you use SWR, you don't have to.
Sure. Okay. Sure. But I still think it's really hard to write effects. Like my point is not. My point is that if you use effects
for application code are complex.
Yeah, and if you use effects, you actually have to think through all these situations if you truly want to avoid the component did mount bug. And a lot of times we don't care. Like we just don't. Right. We have the notion. That's exactly what you just said. We have the notion of like when I start, fetch the users, keep them stale, and edit them. But like you
to force you to think about that every time, it's a lot to ask.
Yeah,
it's a lot.
Yeah,
it's a lot. I'm 100% with you, man. when we were doing the animation stuff, and all we want to do is when you click on a table of contents section in the Mirage Docs website, you expand and collapse, and you call an animate function. But now it's using a use spring hook, and it depends on the state of which thing's open and which thing's closed. And now you're forced, when all you're doing is trying to add this little flourish, now you are forced to confront every possible situation from one transition to one, every possible transition from one state to another state. Because in the event any of those dependencies change or any of the inputs to the spring change, the spring's going to try to reanimate. So what we did was end up doing some crazy stuff to only run the animation when the user clicks on it, if they've clicked on it, and in the use previous to compare is open going from false to true or true to false. Otherwise, animate is immediate true.
Yeah.
And that way, as all this stuff is changing and the components re-rendering and the use spring hook is getting run again and again, it's not doing anything. Now, I will say, like, that's a pain in the ass because you literally are just trying to do one thing. Like, in this moment, I want to click on this thing and expand it. That's all I want to do. And React is saying, like, no, you can't do that. Like, if you're going to add this code, you are going to think about every way that this can change right now from the beginning. And so that's a lot. But because we happen to be using this use measure code to calculate the width and the height of the dynamic sized elements, it worked out in that case. For that edge case that we would not have considered, the programming model did force us to consider it. And so that is the fruits of the declarative effectful programming model at work. So that's an example of it working. But there was also, you have to weigh that against all the bugs that we introduced and all the time we spent accommodating the different situations that we didn't care at all about, but we were forced to deal with because of effects running every single render.
Yep. I think there's tension here between, like, listen, me as a programmer, I know what my component should do at every single step. And then there's also, on the other side, there's React saying,
you don't.
you don't. You're actually introducing bugs, and we are going to force you into this model that makes you consider it. And listen, at the end of the day, you're
going to write more correct code.
Yeah, you do end up with better code. The problem is was that worth it?
Yeah.
And I don't know. Like, I can't answer that. Right? It's like different for everyone.
That's super interesting, but I mean, I think that's a great way to phrase it. In some sense, it is forcing you to write more correct code. But if what does it mean? Is it always worth it to write more correct code? No. There's it's not a black and white thing. Of course not. No. There's all sorts of bugs in code that we've written before. Untyped language like JavaScript. I mean, there's all sorts of things that could happen there. So I would say if it's like a Pareto improvement, like in economics, a situation is a Pareto improvement if at least someone is better off and no one's worse off. So if you get to the point in React where you have enough libraries such that the things you would use effect for can be provided by hooks and you are just as productive as you were before, but now you're accounting for edge cases that you wouldn't have before, so you're not worse off, but there are edge cases that are better off, then we can say maybe conclusively like it's a better programming model.
Yeah, I think if we get to a point where, like what I was talking about, like you have this static list of users from the server and then you're buffering your changes in some other state, and that's too hard for people to do on their own. Well, at least it's too hard.
I mean, maybe people aren't doing that. Maybe we're doing that because we're like learning this stuff deeply. But
they're absolutely not doing it. What they're doing is they're adding an effect
React query
with
or whatever.
zero. No, they're adding an effect with an empty dependency. Right? You go on Stack Overflow.
How do you know they're not just using Apollo? Okay, Stack Overflow.
You go on Stack Overflow and seriously go on Stack Overflow, search React hooks, and bring up the first 10 things that use effect, and they will all have use effect with an empty array. People,
even if there are dependencies being ignored,
they're ignoring.
There are dependencies.
There are dependencies. They're ignoring them because what they really want.
I'm saying there's not always dependencies in an effect. Like an effect with an empty dependency, right, is not ipso facto of a violation of the lint rule.
Right. I'm saying
it's a violation once you bring in
yes.
state or or a function, anything that is changing.
Yeah, anything that can change. Yeah, there are things in there that can change. They just want to express their code as when the component mounts, I want to fetch data.
I see.
I want to edit that data.
What do they do? They add a lint ignore rule or something?
I don't.
Or they just.
I honestly, I don't even know if people use a lint rule because there's no. It's not commented out. And so I just want to. I want to layer. I want to layer more. And more on here. So I think there's something interesting. If I go back to the example about like the function changing, causing the effect to run, your mental model as a developer is like that function wraps up business logic, right? How to fetch a user. That function, like from you, cannot change, right? Changing that function,
the same thing every time it runs.
Changing that function requires a redeploy and a page refresh.
Like
your model is that it can't change, but however, it actually could change. You can imagine like there's a million ways it could change. Like maybe the implementation of how it fetches data changes from like HTTP request to a WebSocket. There's,
based on a browser or something like that.
There's a million, but your mental model is like, no, this is how I fetch a user. It's not changing. So I think there's definitely tension there where I just want to ignore this thing. I know it's not going to change.
It's the fact that the way JavaScript works is forcing you to think about it as if it were a changing thing when in reality, well, let's read this really quick. Use callback. Returns a memoized callback. Pass an inline callback and array of dependencies. Use callback will return a memoized version of the callback that only changes if one of the dependencies has changed. This is useful when passing callbacks to optimize child components that rely on reference equality to prevent unnecessary renders. Yeah, so that I was thinking I was going to say something different, but that is about preventing unnecessary renders. Note the array of dependencies is not passed as arguments. Conceptually, though, that's what they represent. Every value referenced inside the callback should also appear in the dependencies array. So even there, you couldn't necessarily avoid it if you have to pass in dependencies.
No, because what you do is you get a memoized function back. So that function is the user ID is changing, but the function is not changing. So it's actually the behavior that you originally wanted. But I don't know. I don't like this answer because
it doesn't seem like a good answer.
If I'm using a library that doesn't use callback or has a buggy use callback or just...
It doesn't even matter. It shouldn't... It doesn't... I mean, if it's not about preventing unnecessary renders, that's not what this is about at all.
Yeah.
It's not about that.
Yeah.
It's just not about that. Man, that's what this says it's useful for. That's the reason this exists.
Yeah. It's not about preventing unnecessary renders. It's preventing unnecessary effects from running is what we're interested in.
Yeah, exactly. So if you pull the function definition, let's say you had a function definition, you pull it outside of the component.
You're good. That's actually one of the pieces of advice that the React guides give you for dealing with this.
Yeah. But but the problem is if the function wants to interact with other state and anything returned from other hooks, now you're screwed because the whole benefit of the whole programming model is that you're just working with variables and local variable access and closure scope. And now you can't do that anymore if you define your function outside. So what the heck do you do?
Yeah. And also too, like think of like your typical data fetching library. It's pretty awesome that it can use a hook and it can like get data from a context, like configuration data from a context.
Yeah.
This is stuff you get to fairly quickly when building a React app. So there might.
So what do you do?
So
you just have to use one of the other tricks where you use previous or in compare values and stuff like that.
Yeah, what I did is I said, I wanted to be like, part of this was about like me really understanding the programming model. So I said, it's okay if this thing reruns. I don't mind this thing rerunning.
Yeah.
And what this thing is doing, what the state that this is setting is users on the server. So I can't edit them, right? My form, as a user is typing in the form, it can't actually edit this array because my form cannot edit users on the server. So this made it clear. Right. It's like, okay, there was state that I was missing.
So would you have two different effects then?
I had one effect that...
to fetch.
That fetched, and the effect just constantly ran on every render. So it's like, okay, maybe there's like unnecessary network requests, but I'm not worried about that today. And yeah, I would...
because it relied on a function?
It relied on a function.
Oh, because you removed the dependencies completely.
No, I put the...
you put the dependencies in.
Both the dependencies in.
And the param.
Yeah, but the function was coming from another hook that was causing the identity of the function to change on every render.
Yeah.
Also, too, like just, I can go wrap that function and use callback because I have access to that code. So
yeah, but that's not that to
Right.
me. That's like that.
Right.
I mean, for all the reasons we just said, that's not good. But it would. I would think. I would feel like the better solution conceptually is to use previous, have the effect run every time with no dependency array, and do a use previous and compare it.
yeah, so this is the other thing. It's like, sorry, my voice is. Give me some water.
It's Monday, man. Go ahead, take a swig, buddy.
I
Let me
have
tell
no-
everyone a joke while you go.
I have no water up here. So
Oh, you don't. We can go get some, man.
all right, give me one
We
second.
can just yeah, no problem. I'm not going to tell a joke. Oh, I know what I can talk about while Ryan's getting water. I watched this crazy. Oh, I know what I can talk about while Ryan's getting water. I watched this crazy movie on Friday or Saturday. I can't remember. It was called "They Were Never Really Here," or "They Were Never Really There," and it had Joaquin Phoenix in it. They were never really here. Had Joaquin Phoenix in it, and don't interrupt me. I'm having a monologue. And it's about him as a grizzled war veteran who's basically hired to take care of some business, kind of Liam Neeson Taken style. And, I love that genre of movie where something crazy happens and there's a dark figure, dark character who's about to get revenge. This is kind of like a lot of the plots of Quentin Tarantino's movies. But, man, this movie is pretty dark, pretty intense. But the directing was incredible, and the cinematography was incredible as well. And the music was also very, very good. And Joaquin Phoenix is one of my favorite actors, honestly. I mean, he is so impressive. I was talking to the audience, not that you care because you left us, about this movie called They Were Never Really Here. And it has Joaquin Phoenix in it, and it was excellent. It's a little dark, but it's really, really cool.
Nice.
So that's what I did on Saturday. And now I have queued up The Master, which is another movie with Joaquin Phoenix that I haven't seen.
I've heard that. I have that on my list. I will probably
Nice.
never watch it, but it's who's the guy that directed it? It's
Philip Seymour Hoffman's in it, I think.
Paul something. It's the guy that did like Boogie Nights and
Oh, cool. Really?
yeah. What is his name? I always blank on director names.
Paul Thomas Anderson.
That's it.
Nice.
Yep.
So yeah, that one's probably going to be great.
That's supposed to be like a movie that movie lovers love.
Nice.
So yeah, let me know how it is.
Yeah, I will. I've been doing good about going through my list. I still want to make my little app, but the recipe app would get more use these days. So I think I'm going to do the recipe app. Oh, he did There Will Be Blood, this director. Yeah, that was a crazy movie. Punch Drunk Love, I never saw that. Boogie Nights. What else did he do? Yeah, interesting. I want to rewrite my restaurants app, my recipes app on Next, because the new Next version just came out and I want to actually try Next. But I already have the backend set up with Hasura, so I could just change it out with Next, and I think that'd be pretty fun. Anyways, let's pick up back at the conversation. Where were we at? So yeah, I think the better solution than using callback to trick the effect to not run, to think it hasn't changed, is to have it run every time and use previous and compare and be meticulous and say, which is basically going back to life cycle. Now you're not exactly going back to life cycle.
Let's be very clear. You are going back to life cycle.
I don't know if you are,
but I think this is okay because you're telling React like, okay, I had a bug previously where I was doing work and component did mount, and I didn't account for the fact that the user ID could change. And so now if imagine you instead of useEffect, we had like use depends on, and it took an array of all the things that should trigger this update.
Yeah.
There's no concept of like the component did mount, right? It's like use depends on. When these things change, I want this function to run. So if I like use depends on user ID, fetch user.
Right.
So here I've actually prevented the component did mount bug. The bug that was biting.
You're not thinking about life cycles anymore.
I'm not thinking about life cycles, and
that makes sense to me.
But you are. I want to be clear.
You're using life cycles to implement use depends on,
and you're also
conceptually you're not thinking about it.
You are also introducing the. I need to give this thing a name. I want to call it like the classic component did mount bug. Like I want a name for this.
Yeah.
But
you're acknowledging the concept of time because you're exactly saying I need to run this code when the state changes from a previous value to a new value.
Yeah. I mean, we can even dismiss time from the. I mean, yes, it does come down to time, but I don't think we need to bring that in yet. I think we can. It's just you're running this function when this value changes, but you're not acknowledging what should happen if the function changes, right? So you're running fetch user when the user ID changes, but what if fetch user changes? Your component is technically now in a bad state.
Well, maybe if it doesn't necessarily, not necessarily, it depends.
It's again, it's like the classic
It's up to you.
component did mount bug.
Yeah. You're saying if this were to be like the first class way to do it, then there's nothing about it that would help prevent those kinds of bugs. Right. That's correct.
But I want to acknowledge.
But there's also a very easy way to fix them. It's much easier than using component did update and extracting the function.
Yes.
And it also doesn't introduce a ton of new bugs that the always run thing does.
Right.
So it might be a better trade-off.
So there's like the actual bug was we weren't accounting for when the user ID changes. The higher level concept is that when things change, we need to rerun them. The reality is we can fix the actual bug without going to the higher level concept. So we can have a hook that's like did change. It takes a user ID. Did change is not a good thing because it like depends on is a better name.
Yeah, depends
it's
on.
like declarative. Good, It's this thing depends on the user ID. When the user ID changes, we fetch the user. That's how the component initially.
It's like useEffect for dependencies, and then you pass in an effect and you pass in the dependencies.
Yeah, and so although we still have the bug in our app, we don't consider that fetch user can ever change. Right, business logic doesn't change.
Hold on, to be clear, it's not a bug.
What is it? We still have the.
It's a potential
vector.
Pitfall. Yeah, it's a potential pitfall for certain things, but in this case, it would be a bug to redo it just because fetch user changed. Because from the perspective of the domain of the app, it didn't, and so it's actually not a bug. It would be a bug to leave it there.
Bug is not the right term. It's.
But yeah, you are sealing up a potential like foot gun. It's a foot gun. It's a potential foot gun. You have a potential to fall into that trap again where you haven't thought about rerunning the code when a certain param changes because you're not forced to put every possible changing param into the dependency list. But maybe that's a better trade-off overall than having to work around it.
Yeah.
I mean, if that's what we end up doing every time, then why not do it?
And also, too, it prevents the thing that like I keep coming back to is like the original thesis of component did mount is buggy because it doesn't account for change. Using something like depends on actually does account for change, and it does.
It has an API for it, even if it doesn't force you into it the way raw root level useEffect does. It acknowledges it and provides you the easiest possible way to do it without you having to write use previous yourself. So how would you implement this as an effect that runs all the time and just uses previous?
I have it. Let's put it in the show notes because I have it.
Dude, you should put it. I want it in all my apps too because I would literally use that instead of effect probably every single time.
I started off with use did change, right? And so I started writing that out, and that takes a prop. And it does a ref, and then it updates the ref in useEffect. So it's like a after render callback, if you will.
So it's like use depends on, and then you pass in like sam.name, first name, and then you have a function as a second parameter. And then within the implementation of use did change, you just compare the first parameter every single time, and if it changed between renders, you rerun the function.
Yeah, and I do some like kind of like some stuff. So I pass in an array of dependencies. Yeah. And then I serialize that array. I literally do JSON stringify
comparison.
It.
Yeah.
Because that is going to flatten everything. It's going to take objects and flatten them.
Yeah.
Because objects could change between renders. But
dude, so I'm glad you did that, man, because it's hard to know. Use SWR when I was working on my thing, they do literal JavaScript equality. And so you very quickly start re-triggering things when you don't want to. But then you realize that if you write in like I actually didn't trigger things when I wanted to because the object was the same reference, even though I was changing properties out from under it. And so I had to use this immutable programming style with splatting, even though it was obvious I was changing things. So the serialization strategy would have caught that. But I wonder, they chose that for a certain reason. I don't think it's just because they're horny about immutable programming.
Yeah, I mean, the serializing things as JSON to compare changes, it's really like, it's probably slow. It's probably slow AF.
But it's more convenient. I mean, it's more what you would expect to happen. So I can just change a property and like it's going to be different. It's like, yeah, of course. So.
My model when I'm working with components is if I have a Pojo called user and it has an ID property, and then I have a different Pojo with an ID property and it has the same ID as my user ID, those two users are the same. Like
got you.
Even though they're two different objects and those objects don't have identity, I consider in my programs that those two users would be the same. So that's why I serialize as JSON and compare the strings.
Got you. Okay, cool.
And then,
so how's it work?
It works. I mean, it works great. I don't know.
Nice.
There's this voice in the back of my head that says, okay, but listen, the React programming model is doing this for a reason, forcing you to think about effects for a reason to prevent these lifecycle bugs. And you're opting out of it with this. So there's
but what if they didn't anticipate how many bugs they were introducing, and the net outcome is worse?
Yeah, I think,
and it's still good that we have that lowest level because you can go to town on making custom hooks.
Yeah, I think that
it's pretty interesting though.
I think that life cycles. So I think there's a few things here. If you're going to write,
if everyone's avoiding them anyway, then it doesn't matter that the use effect runs the way it does.
If everyone is going to say, I only want this effect to run once, and they add an empty dependency array to get behavior like use on mount, then I think we are far worse off because you just wrote component did mount. You didn't prevent any of the component did mount bugs, and you did it in a syntax that
it's not clear what's happening.
No one, like, people can't explain this, right? Like, give this to a new developer. How do I make this only once? It's not intuitive. It's bad. So I think that if we're going to use this empty dependency array to make our effects only run once, then we should just be explicit and we should say use on mount. Now, use on mount is actually not. I think it's not a good thing. It's not a good name because it kind of like implies implementation. It implies life cycle. But you could imagine
use once or something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Use once, right? Use depends on use once. These aren't talking about the
render.
These aren't talking about the implementation of how the change happens or how the component mounts. Think about use once. Like, my component could be mounted and unmounted, but as long as I have the same instance of a component, which I don't once it gets unmounted. Right. But imagine I did for some reason. Use once would still be valid. Like, use once is still a way to talk about this thing.
Yeah, it's like if you on the REPL, on Mirage, if you go there and you could use once and instantiate code mirror, that's kind of what you want to do. Like, really, once the whole time you are on the REPL.
Yeah, yeah. So I think that if you're going to use all these this inside knowledge to implement lifecycle hooks, but okay, this is one thing I find really funny is people will say, don't use lifecycle hooks. Lifecycle hooks are bad. Use effect with an empty dependency array. And I'm making a straw man here, but I do think it's funny that there's advice that says that. So I think we're better off in saying right now, I don't want to think about all the ways my component can change. Because that's hard. It is. It's really hard. And for this app that I'm building, I need to fetch users when the page renders. I need to edit them, and I need to save them back to the server, and that's it. And so I should be able to opt into lifecycle here. And so I can say use once, use depends on, and guess what? Those are going to make my app less buggy. Like, they're going to make my app less buggy than juggling component did mount, component did update, comparing props between those two. Use depends on is still a declarative API because I'm not describing, let's think about this. I'm not describing how the thing can change. I'm just saying that when this thing changes, run this code.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, definitely.
So that's
yeah, and you're not juggling object instances and checking equality and stuff either. I mean, it's a very declarative. It's a very nice API for that.
Yeah, exactly. You're not saying what does it mean for the thing to change? Like, if they're two different instances, but they have the same properties, is that a change? And you're hiding all that behind this use depends on interface. So I think this is
it's pretty interesting. Basically, it's like you should have a way to get into it progressively. Like,
that's good. Like, okay, I'm writing a component, and the first thing I should do is like use once and fetch data, and then as bugs come up, first of all, you might not have bugs because you're
a lot of times you won't.
Use depends on is going to address the classic component did mount bug, because it nicely adapts when the ID changes, when the user's ID changes.
Right.
So, if we can just go, we can write components that we never need to touch again because use depends on solves it, that we actually don't need people understanding, this whole conversation about what useEffect is doing and how useEffect can run.
That's pretty interesting. And then useEffect is always there for like library authors who want to go even lower level,
Yeah. Or when you do have a bug, when the function that you're calling and use depends on can change, you can now actually think about, okay, what is it? What is the state I'm representing? What should happen? And you can really dive deep in there.
Right.
But it's way too hard for, seriously, it's way for building a form where you list users and edit them. It's
going right to every single effect, running every single render is a huge, from 0 to that is a huge leap for sure.
Yeah.
I think that's really interesting. I think thinking about it as, so it's like, can you start off with something that is better than nothing, better than React class components or lifecycle APIs, for the reasons that you discussed, but doesn't up the complexity level to root useEffect. And the React core team might argue, like, again, the useEffect should run every time any dependency changes because that is technically correct. But if the reality turns out to be that you're writing more buggy code, then it might be better overall to have an intermediate stopgap.
Yeah, this is an internal argument that, this whole last week as I'm writing all this, I'm having in my head that it's just like, I can make the argument that I want use depends on use once, but the useEffect code is actually better in the end. If time was not a cost.
What would you do with the fetch users thing? Use callback? That's not better code.
What would I do with the fetch user? No. I would instead of set state users equals, response.users, it would be set state users from server is response.users. And then I would buffer all my changes locally. So if the effect reruns, like, I literally don't care because it's not going to overwrite any of the edits any of the local changes that I'm making to that user's state.
But if the effect reruns and it starts hitting your network, that's not good code. That's not good code.
Well, I think at that point, then we can talk about, okay, so this is
you're saying that's a performance optimization, not a technical correctness.
Exactly.
And I don't know if that's true, man.
By the way, you're highlighting here the argument that goes on in my head because right now, when I'm talking to you, I'm taking the position of like this pure, our components need to rerun. But
the thing is, the function didn't change. It literally changed, but it didn't. The
business logic didn't change, but the function changed.
Exactly.
But React React can't know that like the function is the same, but the business.
No, I know, but I'm saying, let's say, no, but if the effect had some sort of side effect, then it would be worse code. It would not be better code. You would have to stop it from having the effect.
Side effect being, we're going to hammer your server every render asking for the list of users.
But that's easy because that's an easy case for the purist to make, because the purist can say, oh, well, now we're talking about optimization for performance reasons, not technical correctness, and therefore, I win. It's still the most technically correct. But if you're having a side effect, it's not.
Thank you. This is this is the internal thing that's been going in my head. When I start to like write out notes on this, I feel like the purist always wins. I feel like I get backed.
It's tempting.
Yeah, I get backed into a corner. Like,
I don't think so, man. I don't think so. I think there's a million cases you could come up with where the effect is is not impure or not non-idempotent or has a side effect in your system. That is, it's not idempotent. And from a business logic perspective, it would be a bug for it to rerun, even if at the technical level there are certain JavaScript objects that are changing and causing it to rerun when written in this kind of purist way. So it's going to be bad code, and you're going to have to accommodate the fact that JavaScript is saying that these things are changing. Like when you use values in an effect, it doesn't vary their values.
Yeah. But when you use objects
but when you use objects, even if the objects are the same from the perspective of the business logic, they're not the same from the perspective of the JavaScript memory. And so the code's going to rerun, but that is a bug in your program. It's a bug in your program. It's absolutely a bug if your page says the user just visited this thing 10 times and they visited it once. So it's a bug because your component's re-rendering because of some animation library or something. That's a bug.
That's a really good point. Imagine that there was also business logic on the server that tracked like how many times the user requested a list of users. Mm-hmm. And now that this effect is rerunning, we actually need to account limits for this. And so like from React's point of view, it's like technically correct, logically complete.
Yeah, I don't think they're saying that. I don't think the purest argument is that like they give you the tools to avoid the rerunning code because they acknowledge that it's not everything is not declarative, yet. Everything cannot just be pure yet in the world. Or not even yet. There's edges of your program that need to have actual effects that aren't idempotent or whatever.
But wouldn't their solution here be to use callback? And
I don't know. That's a good question. That seems ridiculous to me. If that's a great question, you have a simple function that knows how to talk to the server, and you want to use that's coming from a hook, and you do it in a useEffect to fetch the call, and how would you solve the fact that it's going to rerun every time, even though the function's not changing from the perspective of your business domain? That's a great question to ask.
Maybe another way to ask this outside of React is just if I have a function and it does the same thing every time.
How do I let the code know?
Should I be returning? Is it wrong for me to return a new function identity? Like, should I be returning the same function every single time?
You shouldn't have to think about that.
No. I mean, strong agree. Strong agree. But I think that the tools.
Well, this is like
the tools that we have. They force you to. They make you think about that. We don't have high enough level tools.
Well, I mean, to Yehuda's credit, going back to our interview with him, he said the only reason some of these things are the way they are is because the React decided it wanted to use closures and free variables to do this, but that leads you down this path where you do not have a separation between functionality and data that changes over time, state. Whereas like classes is what that gives you. Like you write a method on a class and it's the same for the length of that deploy because it's code and it's the same thing. And the state that changes over time is the properties on that object. And those are cleanly separated. And so no part of the programming model has to ask the question, do I need to do something different because the methods change? Because the method's not changing. Yep. It's the data that's changing. So maybe a class is the answer.
I know, but then we're back at we go from.
I don't know if you have to go back to the component did mount bug just because you introduce classes. You don't have to introduce classes. I think you could do the React model of re-rendering things, but use object like classes for the API to how to define methods and state and separate the two so that depends on JavaScript equality works in your favor as opposed to against you.
Okay. And you can have like depends on be part of the class, and it can basically using classes doesn't mean you have to use did mount and will unmount. You can come up with APIs that react to change.
Totally.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, there's.
I think probably Vue is closer to that. I guess I don't know how it all works. They do have like a mounted hook and stuff, but they also have that new composition API. But I think the composition API was designed specifically in a way that's different from React hooks to avoid the stale state closure bugs. So I think, although it doesn't use classes, I think, but yeah, interesting. We'll have to check that out. It's pretty interesting. But
I am,
I think there's a lot of concepts here, right? Yep. There's like avoiding classes, so that you can just use functions and closures. There is the fact that those change over time, and then there's this idea of re-rendering everything every single render, and how to best make code that shouldn't, from the perspective of the domain, do that, fit with that paradigm.
Yep.
And yeah, so that's pretty interesting. Cool, man. I want to get my hands on that use depends on.
I will. Why don't I just
use it literally every time instead of useEffect?
It's good, right? Because it's doing what you want.
Because I feel like I want to go there every time, anyways.
Yeah, it prevents the user ID did change bug, which is, I think, at the end of the day, the thing that always bites me, that got me really excited about effects. But it doesn't go the full distance. It doesn't go that complete problem that effects are trying to solve, which is fine, right?
Right.
So,
cool.
I want to come up with more examples for this. So the function changing, I think, is a good one, because it's something you don't expect to change, but it's also, I think it's very easy to just say, you should be using, if you have a hook that's returning a function, it should use callback, and people can just dismiss it. I feel like effects are hard to write, so there should be more examples of this. So I'm definitely on the lookout for these things.
Nice. Cool. If you have an example, send Ryan a tweet.
Yeah. Ryan.
Or tweet us at front end first.
Yeah, tweet at front end first, and we'll...
Yep. And be able to talk about it. All right, you cool cats and kittens. That's it for this week. You clearly haven't watched Tiger King, have you?
No.
Or else I would have gotten at least a smile out of that. I just got a look of a quizzical look. Everyone, thanks for joining us. If you can't tell, I'm tired. It's Monday, but I'm excited to get into some code today. I'm going to make my 5th cup of coffee. I'm going to go eat some healthy food to accommodate the 2 cookies I had this morning. I hope you all are safe. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
See ya.